I am Clara, 68 years old. I spent my entire life scrubbing floors and baking pies to raise my only son, Marcus, into a successful man. But before the soil on his grave was even settled, my daughter-in-law walked up to me at his repast and handed me a formal 30-day eviction notice. The fellowship hall of my church was thick with grief and the heavy scent of fried chicken and pound cake. I stood in the corner, my hands trembling as I held a cup of lukewarm tea. My heart was completely shattered. I had just buried my only child. A sudden heart attack had taken him from me without warning, leaving a void that I thought would swallow me whole. The guests were still eating, offering their condolences in hushed voices, but I felt entirely alone in a room full of people. Before the last guests had even put their plates in the trash, Valerie approached me. She dropped her grieving widow act the moment she stepped out of the pastor's line of sight. Her eyes were dry, and her face was set in stone. Without a single word of comfort, she coldly shoved a thick manila envelope into my hands. I opened it with shaking fingers. It was a formal eviction notice. I had 30 days to vacate the small in-law suite where I lived. That suite was on the property I had drained my entire retirement savings to help Marcus buy. I gave them every penny I had to make sure they had a beautiful home. I looked up at her, unable to comprehend the cruelty. Valerie sneered, leaning in close so only I could hear the venom in her voice. She whispered that Marcus left everything to her, and she had absolutely no intention of playing caretaker to a useless old woman. The disrespect was so profound, and her voice carried just enough that a few church elders sitting nearby turned their heads. Sister Jenkins gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, but Valerie did not care. She turned on her heel and strutted away, leaving me standing there, holding the paper that erased my entire future. I felt the room spinning. I gave up my life savings for that house. I was the one who cooked their meals and babysat their child. How could she throw me out on the street on the day we buried my son? Just then, little Maya ran up and wrapped her tiny arms around my legs. She looked up at me with her big brown eyes, completely innocent to the wickedness her mother had just unleashed. "Grandma," she said in her sweet voice, "why was Mommy looking for Daddy's safe combination while he was at the hospital?" The question hit me like a bucket of ice water. While my son was taking his final breaths in a sterile hospital room, his wife was at home tearing apart his office for money. The grief inside me suddenly mixed with a cold and sharp suspicion. Valerie was planning this. She was securing the assets while my boy was fighting for his life. I kissed Maya on the forehead and told her to go play with her cousins. The tears I wanted to shed dried up instantly. I left the church hall without saying goodbye to anyone. I walked the 2 blocks back to the house, clutching the eviction notice in my hand. The house was dead quiet. I walked past the main living room and went straight around the back to my small suite. I felt devastated, homeless, and betrayed. But when I opened the door to my bedroom, I stopped dead in my tracks. Waiting right in the middle of my neatly made bed was a certified letter. I walked over and picked it up. It was from a private attorney, a man I knew Valerie did not even know existed. Across the front of the heavy white envelope were words that made my heart race. It was marked to be opened immediately upon my death. I barely slept that night. The heavy white envelope sat on my nightstand like a ticking time bomb. The very next morning, I put on my good black suit, the same one I wore to bury my boy, and drove straight to the address printed on the letterhead. The attorney was a sharp-looking man named Mr. Sterling. He sat me down in his large mahogany office and offered me a glass of water before looking me dead in the eye. He told me things that made my head spin and my heart ache all over again. Marcus had come to see him just 3 weeks before his fatal heart attack. My son had drawn up a secret, updated will without his wife knowing a single thing about it. Mr. Sterling slid the thick legal document across the desk and pointed to my name. I was appointed as the sole executor of the estate. But that was not the shocker. Tucked deep within the pages was a highly specific and bizarre hidden clause. Valerie would only inherit the house, the money, and the assets if she could pass a comprehensive, federally verified background check. Furthermore, she was required to produce an original, certified birth certificate directly to me. If she failed to meet those exact conditions within 30 days, every single thing my son owned would be locked into an irrevocable trust for little Maya. I drove back to the house with my heart pounding wildly against my ribs. Why on earth would Marcus demand a federal background check on his own wife? What did my son find out? When I walked into the kitchen, Valerie was sitting at the center island, drinking a large glass of white wine. It was barely noon. She glared at me as I walked in, probably expecting me to start begging for my living arrangements. Instead, I pulled out a copy of the will and gently explained the new clause to her. I watched her face closely. The color completely drained from her cheeks, leaving her looking like a ghost. Her wineglass hit the granite counter with a loud, sharp clack, spilling pale liquid over the edge. She immediately started pacing the kitchen like a trapped animal. Her breathing turned ragged. She stammered, raising her voice, and claimed she could never produce an original birth certificate because it was destroyed in a terrible house fire when she was a small child. She dramatically waved her hands, saying all her family records burned to ashes and the courthouse had lost her files. But my maternal intuition flared up instantly. A mother pays attention to details. I vividly remembered Marcus paying nearly $1,000 to expedite Valerie's passport for their luxury Caribbean anniversary trip just 2 years ago. I remembered it because Marcus had complained to me about the rush fees. You absolutely need a certified birth certificate to get a United States passport. The lie was right there in front of my face, naked, desperate, and clumsy. I did not say a word about the passport. I just nodded slowly, letting her dig her own grave. Over the next few days, the house turned into an absolute madhouse. Valerie was completely unraveling. She stopped pretending to mourn my son. I would lie awake in my suite and hear her pacing the upstairs hallways at 2 a.m. The sound of heavy packing tape ripping echoed through the air vents. I saw her dragging heavy cardboard boxes down the stairs in the dead of night, frantically packing up silverware, designer clothes, and anything of value she could get her hands on. The timeline of her entire life story started crumbling in my mind. She had always told Marcus she grew up an orphan with no living relatives and no past. But if that was true, why was she suddenly so desperate to liquidate everything and run? 2 days later, a strange man I had never seen before showed up in our driveway with a thick wad of cash. Valerie was aggressively trying to sell Marcus's vintage Mustang and his daily driver SUV for pennies on the dollar before the probate process even closed. She was handing over the keys when I marched right out onto the porch. I stood my ground and threatened to call the police for theft of estate property, chasing the shady buyer away. Valerie screamed at me, her face red with pure rage, calling me a meddling old fool. But the panic in her wide eyes betrayed her. She was a woman running out of time. The air in the house was thick with dark secrets. I needed to find out exactly what my son knew before he died. The following afternoon, while Valerie was supposedly out meeting with her own frantic lawyers, I slipped into Marcus's home office. I told myself I was just going in there to retrieve some of Maya's coloring books to keep the child occupied. But the truth was I was hunting for answers. The room smelled faintly of his favorite cologne, and my eyes immediately filled with hot tears. I missed my boy so much. But then I noticed something completely wrong near his heavy oak desk. The expensive Persian rug was pushed aside in a wrinkled mess. The hardwood floorboards underneath had been violently pried up. Jagged wood splinters were scattered all across the floor. I dropped to my aching knees and looked down into the dark gap. It was Marcus's hidden floor safe. The heavy metal door was wide open, and the inside was completely empty. Valerie had beaten me to it. All his private documents, all his emergency cash, everything was gone. But in her frantic, greedy rush, she missed one tiny thing. Way in the back corner of the dark metal safe, half hidden by the shadows, was a cheap black burner phone. Marcus never used burner phones. He was a corporate man who lived on his smartphone. I reached in and pulled it out, my fingers trembling. I pressed the power button and prayed the battery was not dead. The bright screen lit up, showing no recent calls and no contacts. But there was one single unsent text message saved in the drafts folder. It was typed on the exact night before he went to the hospital with chest pains. I read the glowing words on the screen and felt all the breath leave my lungs. The message simply said, "I know who you really are." I spent the next 2 days moving around that house like a ghost trapped in my own life. Marcus's burner phone was hidden safely under my mattress. Those words, "I know who you really are," burned into my mind every time I looked at Valerie. She kept packing her movements sharp and frantic, tossing items into cardboard boxes while avoiding my gaze entirely. I had to stay calm. I had to play the part of the grieving, helpless mother, while my brain worked overtime. My only anchor in that house of lies was my sweet granddaughter Maya. I had to protect her, keep her routine normal, and shield her from the storm I knew was coming. On Thursday afternoon, Maya came home from school with a big smile on her face and a green folder tucked under her arm. Her teacher had assigned a family tree project. We sat at the big oak dining table, the very same table where my son used to eat his breakfast. The air smelled of sweet paste and sugary juice boxes. I spread out the green construction paper, the safety scissors, and the little sticks of glue. Maya had a plastic bag filled with loose photographs she had gathered from around the house. We spent an hour cutting out pictures of Marcus, of me, of her cousins, and gluing them onto the paper branches. It was a beautiful, innocent moment, a rare pocket of peace in a home that felt like it was slowly suffocating me. "Grandma, I need a picture of Mummy. To put right here next to Daddy," Maya said, her little finger tapping an empty circle on the green paper. I told her to look through the bag and pick her favorite one, but Maya shook her head. Her brown eyes widening with a mischievous spark, she leaned in close, lowering her voice as if she were telling me a giant secret. "I have a special picture of Mommy," she whispered. "I found it in her big shiny jewelry box upstairs, the one she told me never to touch." I froze the glue stick, hovering in my hand. My heart gave a little jolt. I knew exactly which jewelry box she meant. It was a heavy, velvet-lined antique box Marcus had bought her for their first anniversary. Valerie treated it like a vault. Maya reached deep into her small overall pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. She smoothed it out against the table with her tiny hands. It was a crumpled, faded photograph, the kind that looks like it had been handled 1,000 times and then shoved away in a panic. I put down the glue and pulled the picture closer. My breath caught in my throat. It was Valerie, but she looked about 10 years younger. Her hair was styled completely differently, dyed a bright honey blonde instead of her natural dark brown. She was wearing a cheap, faded waitress uniform, something the Valerie I knew would not be caught dead wearing. But that was not the part that made my blood run cold. She was standing in front of a rundown trailer home, a place that looked nothing like the upscale neighborhoods she claimed she grew up in. And wrapped tightly in her arms, resting on her hip, was a toddler. A little boy with curly hair and a bright smile. A boy who was definitely absolutely not Maya. I stared at the child in the photo, my mind spinning out of control. Valerie had always sworn up and down that Marcus was her first real relationship, and that Maya was her first and only pregnancy. She played the part of the inexperienced, nervous first-time mother perfectly, but the woman in this photo was holding that little boy with the effortless, natural grip of a seasoned mother. "Who is this sweetie?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady so I would not scare her. Maya pointed her small, glue-covered finger right at Valerie's face. "Look, Grandma," she said, her voice ringing with pure childhood innocence. Mummy looked so pretty when her name was Serena. "Who is that baby she is holding?" The name hit me like a physical blow to the chest. Serena. I looked from the photo to my granddaughter, my hands beginning to shake. "What did you say, Maya? Why did you call her Serena?" I asked, praying I had misheard her. Maya shrugged, swinging her little legs under the table. "That is what it says on the back," she explained casually. "I saw it before. Mummy caught me looking at it last week and got really mad. She snatched it away and yelled at me. But she forgot to lock the box today, so I sneaked it back out for my tree." I flipped the crumpled photograph over. The back of the paper was yellowed with age, but the writing was clear. In faded blue ink, written in a handwriting I did not recognize, were the words Serena and Junior. Fresh start. 2014. I read the words over and over until the letters blurred together. Serena and Junior. 2014. My son did not even meet Valerie until 2018. She came into his life claiming to be an orphan from Seattle with a clean slate and a tragic past. She told him her entire life story, and he believed every single word. We all did. A fresh start. The words echoed in my mind, linking up with everything else I had discovered over the past week. The missing birth certificate, the frantic packing, the desperate attempt to sell Marcus's cars for quick, untraceable cash, the hidden clause in my son's will demanding a federal background check, and that unsent text message on his burner phone. "I know who you really are." It all crashed down on me with a terrifying clarity. Valerie was not just a greedy woman trying to steal my son's estate. Valerie did not even exist. She had an entirely different identity. She had a past she had buried deep underground. And most horrifying of all, she had a missing child. A little boy named Junior, who had simply vanished from her life before she ever met Marcus. I looked down at sweet, innocent Maya, who was happily colouring a green leaf on her paper tree, completely unaware that her entire world was a fabricated lie. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. What kind of monster abandons a child to start a new life under a fake name? What exactly was she running from? And the question that chilled me straight to the bone: did my son find out the truth about Serena? And did he die trying to expose it? I quickly slipped the photo into my pocket, just as I heard the heavy thud of the front door opening. Valerie was home. I sat alone at my small kitchen table, long after the rest of the house had gone completely dark. The crumpled, faded photograph burned a hole in my pocket. Upstairs, Valerie was sleeping soundly in my late son's bed, surrounded by the life she had stolen. The heavy grief that had been crushing my chest for the past week had suddenly vanished. It was entirely replaced by a burning, relentless need for the truth. I had to protect my granddaughter Maya from the stranger sleeping under our roof. I brewed a strong pot of black coffee with the bitter aroma filling the quiet kitchen and opened my laptop. I was not going to let a woman who abandoned her own flesh and blood destroy the only family I had left. For 35 years, I worked as a high school counselor in a bustling district. People always thought my job was just sitting in a cozy office, handing out tissues and talking to teenagers about their feelings. They had no idea how much of my job was actually acting like a detective. I spent decades tracking down missing student records, cross-referencing transferred transcripts from out of state, and finding the raw truth when parents lied about where they lived to get into a better school zone. I knew exactly how to dig into a person's background. I knew how to find the cracks in a fabricated story. Valerie thought I was just a clueless, grieving old woman she could easily throw out on the street. She had vastly underestimated me. I started with the easiest tool I had at my disposal. I created a completely blank social media profile on my computer. I used no name, no photo, and added no friends. I took the old photograph Maya had found in the jewelry box and scanned it into my laptop. Technology has changed so much since my early days at the school district. There are powerful websites now that can scan a facial structure and find matches anywhere on the internet. I uploaded the scanned image and ran a facial recognition search, typing the name Serena alongside it to narrow the results. The search engine spun for what felt like an absolute eternity. My heart pounded wildly against my ribs in the silent kitchen. Page after page of faces loaded on the bright screen. Most were complete dead ends. But then on the fourth page of results, a low-resolution image popped up that made my breath catch. It was the exact same face. The woman in the online photo had the identical sharp jawline, the same narrow nose, and the same cold, calculating eyes. Her hair was blonde, just like in the hidden picture, completely different from the dark brunette locks she wore now. I clicked the link attached to the image. It took me directly to a local newspaper archive from a small, rainy town in Oregon. That was 3 time zones away from our sunny home in Georgia. The digital article was dated nearly 10 years ago. The bold headline read, "Local woman vanishes without a trace." I read the text with a dry mouth and trembling hands. The article detailed how a woman named Serena Vance had disappeared into thin air one rainy Tuesday morning. Her car was found abandoned near a busy bus station with the keys still sitting in the ignition and her purse left on the passenger seat. Neighbors described her as a quiet, devoted mother. But the deeper I read into the archives, the darker and more twisted the story became. She had not been kidnapped. She had not been the victim of foul play. The local police had just issued a massive warrant for her arrest. I needed to know exactly what Serena Vance had done to warrant running away from her entire life. I pulled out my credit card and paid for a comprehensive nationwide public records search. I bypassed the cheap, unreliable background check websites and went straight into the federal court and criminal archives. When the official legal documents finally loaded on my screen, I felt physically sick to my stomach. Serena Vance did not just vanish because she was trapped in an unhappy marriage. She fled from multiple severe felony charges. The court records showed she was facing decades in a federal prison for embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from a charity organization. And it was not just any charity. It was a fund designed to help vulnerable, low-income senior citizens. She had been the head charity accountant. She meticulously drained their retirement funds, ruined their fragile lives, and then packed a single bag and vanished. She abandoned her own husband and her baby boy Junior just to avoid wearing a prison jumpsuit. She left her own innocent child behind to save herself. That was the exact kind of monster sleeping under my roof. That was the woman trying to throw me out on the street. She was a predator who specialized in taking advantage of the elderly. But a burning question remained. How did a wanted fugitive named Serena Vance become the flawless, sophisticated Valerie I knew? I opened a new tab and typed the name Valerie into the National Birth Registry database, using the exact birth date she had written on her marriage certificate when she wed my son, Marcus. The system brought up a legitimate birth record from a small rural county in Texas. For a second, I thought I had hit a wall. But right below the birth certificate was a linked death certificate. The real Valerie had died of severe pneumonia when she was only 6 months old. It is an old, cruel, and highly illegal trick used by desperate fugitives. I remembered reading about it years ago. A person wanders through an old graveyard, finds the headstone of a dead infant born around the same year as them, and requests a copy of the birth certificate, claiming they lost theirs. Because the systems were not always perfectly linked decades ago, they use that fresh piece of paper to apply for a social security card and build a brand new life. She stole a dead baby's identity to become a complete ghost. That was exactly why she panicked in the kitchen when I gently mentioned Marcus's updated will. Marcus had demanded a federally verified background check and an original certified birth certificate. He knew the federal government would immediately flag the death certificate attached to that specific social security number. She was entirely trapped. I sat back in my wooden chair, rubbing my tired eyes. The green digital clock on my stove read 3:15 in the morning. The house was dead quiet, but a terrifying, deafening thought suddenly paralyzed me. Marcus was a brilliantly smart, highly meticulous businessman. If an old, retired school counselor like me could find all this out in a few hours, using a laptop and a credit card, Marcus must have discovered it too. That was why he changed his will in complete secrecy. That was why he pried up the heavy floorboards in his office to hide his burner phone. He was building a case against his own wife. I needed to see what else my boy knew before he died. I quickly opened a new browser window and went to the secure cloud storage website he always used for his important business files. The login screen asked for an email and a password. I typed in his email address. I knew Valerie had obviously tried to break into this account already. She'd been tearing the house apart looking for assets, but she did not know him like a mother knows her son. The password prompt blinked at me. I thought back to his childhood, to the things he loved most before the world made him so serious. I typed in the name of his beloved childhood golden retriever, followed by his high school basketball jersey number. Buster, 42. I held my breath and pressed the enter key. The screen flashed green. Access granted. Tears blurred my vision for a moment. Even from the grave, my son and I were connected. I opened a hidden folder titled simply with the letter V. Inside were dozens of digital files Marcus had secretly compiled over the last few months. There were highlighted bank transfers, detailed private investigator reports, and scanned copies of Serena Vance's old arrest warrants. He had found everything. He knew he was sleeping next to a fugitive. But it was the very last document in the folder that made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. It was a PDF file of an official email correspondence. I clicked it open. It was an appointment confirmation for an in-person meeting with a federal agent at the FBI field office downtown. I checked the date on the digital confirmation. The appointment was scheduled for the exact same morning. Marcus had mysteriously collapsed and died. My son did not die of a random heart attack. He was murdered to keep a ghost hidden. I woke up the next morning, feeling like a woman who had just stepped out of a long, dark nightmare and into the glaring light of a terrible reality. My son Marcus had been carrying a weight so heavy it literally broke his heart. He had been sleeping next to a monster, a woman who stole a dead child's identity to hide from a terrible past. But I did not have the luxury of falling apart. I had a beautiful, innocent granddaughter to protect. I picked up my phone and called Valerie. I forced myself to swallow my pride and my disgust. I kept my voice as smooth and defeated as I possibly could. I told her I was tired of fighting. I told her I wanted to meet at Mr. Sterling's office that afternoon, so I could formally sign the house over to her and be done with the estate probate once and for all. She agreed immediately. Her voice practically dripped with sugary satisfaction. She thought she had broken me. She thought I was just a tired old woman surrendering my entire life to her greed. I drove to the lawyer's office 2 hours early. I needed time to prepare for the biggest battle of my life. I sat down with Mr. Sterling in his large mahogany office and laid out everything I had found. I showed him the old photograph little Maya had cut out for her school project. I showed him the public records search, the old newspaper articles about Serena Vance, and the horrific truth about the embezzlement from the senior citizens' charity. I even showed him the digital file I had put together on my computer, which looked exactly like the file named Link Cao Trien Ngui Me Da, Den_4 .docx that contained all the evidence of her crimes. Mr. Sterling was completely speechless. He reviewed the documents, and his face turned as pale as a sheet. We formulated our plan right then and there. We were not just executing a will. We were setting a trap for a dangerous predator. At exactly 3:00, Valerie walked into the conference room. She was wearing a tailored black dress and carrying a designer handbag, probably bought with my son's hard-earned money. She walked with the confidence of a queen stepping up to claim her crown. She did not even look at me. She sat down across the table, crossed her legs, and smiled a cold, triumphant smile at the lawyer. She asked where the papers were for me to sign away my rights to the house. She stated she had moving boxes waiting and a real estate agent on standby. She wanted me out of my in-law suite by the end of the weekend. She wanted the keys, and she wanted the bank accounts transferred immediately. She was so consumed by her own arrogance that she did not notice the heavy, tense silence hanging in the room. I did not say a single word at first. I just opened my purse and took out a plain white envelope. I reached inside and pulled out the crumpled, faded photograph Maya had found hidden in the velvet lining of the jewelry box. I placed it face up on the polished mahogany table. I placed my index finger on the image and slowly pushed it across the smooth wood, right until it rested perfectly in front of Valerie. The silence in the room was so thick you could hear the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Valerie looked down. I watched her eyes focus on the image of her younger blonde self, standing in front of that run-down trailer, holding a toddler that was definitely not Maya. I watched the arrogant smirk melt completely off her face. The color drained from her skin, leaving her looking hollow and terrified. I finally broke the silence. My voice was steady and hard as stone. I asked her how Junior was doing. I asked her if she ever thought about the little boy she abandoned when she ran away from the felony embezzlement charges. I called her Serena Vance. Hearing her real name spoken out loud hit her like a physical blow. She jerked back in her leather chair, gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned bright white. She tried to open her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The polished, sophisticated widow was completely gone. In her place was a cornered, terrified fugitive. I told her I knew everything. I told her I knew she stole a dead infant's birth certificate to build a fake life. I told her I knew she drained the life savings of vulnerable senior citizens before running away like a coward. Then the true brilliance of my son struck me like a massive earthquake. I looked at Valerie and explained exactly what Marcus had done. I told her that Marcus knew everything. He had hacked into her past. He knew she was a wanted criminal hiding from the federal government. But Marcus was a genius. He knew that if he confronted her directly in their home, she would panic. She would pack a bag, grab little Maya, and vanish into thin air just like she did 10 years ago. She would have stolen my granddaughter, and we would never have seen her again. So my beautiful, brilliant son set a legal trap. He used his last will and testament as an ironclad cage to hold her in place. I leaned across the table and told her about the hidden clause. I told her that Marcus tied her entire inheritance to a federally verified background check for a reason. To get the money, to get the house, to get a single dime from his estate, she had to submit her fingerprints to the federal government. He knew she could never do that. If she submitted to the background check, the federal database would instantly flag her as Serena Vance, the fugitive. She would be arrested on the spot. But if she refused the background check, she would get absolutely nothing, and all the money would go directly into an irrevocable trust for Maya, controlled entirely by me. He forced her into a corner where she had absolutely no way out. She could not touch his wealth without exposing her true identity to the authorities. She was completely trapped by her own endless greed. As I spoke those words, a wave of profound emotional devastation washed over me. My vision blurred with hot tears. I broke down right there in the lawyer's office, not because of Valerie, but because of my son. I realized with sickening clarity the sheer terror Marcus must have lived through during his final weeks on Earth. My poor boy had been sleeping in the same bed as a ruthless criminal. He had to sit across from her at the dinner table, smiling and pretending everything was normal, while his heart pounded with absolute fear. He lived in constant, silent agony, terrified that if he made one wrong move, this monster would steal his daughter in the middle of the night. He spent his final days meticulously planning how to protect me, and how to protect his little girl from beyond the grave. He gathered the evidence and set up the appointment with the FBI all by himself. I wept for the lonely burden my son carried. I pictured him staring at the ceiling in the dark while she slept beside him. He was a father protecting his cub. He knew he was dealing with a woman capable of abandoning her own toddler to save her own skin. He knew she would not hesitate to rip Maya away from her home, her school, and her grandmother. The massive heart attack that took Marcus was not a random tragedy. It was the direct result of the suffocating anxiety she forced upon him. She murdered his spirit before her lies finally stopped his heart. My tears flowed freely, staining the collar of my black dress. I was crying for the beautiful boy I raised who died trying to save his family from a nightmare. Valerie stared at me. Her chest was heaving up and down. The smug mask she had worn for years was completely shattered. There was no more pretend grief. There was no more sophisticated daughter-in-law. Her eyes turned as cold and dead as a shark's. She realized she was not going to get the house. She realized she was not going to get the money. And she realized I held all the evidence that could send her to a federal prison for the rest of her life. She let out a guttural sound like a wild animal. She leaped up from her chair, knocking it backward onto the floor. She lunged across the wide mahogany table, her hands clawing desperately for the folder of evidence sitting near Mr. Sterling. The lawyer pulled it back just in time. Valerie screamed with a raw, terrifying fury. Her voice echoed through the office as she pointed a shaking finger right at my face. She screamed that I had ruined everything. She screamed that she was leaving right now. She promised she was going to drive straight to my house, rip Maya out of her bedroom, and drive away into the night. She vowed that I would spend the rest of my miserable life wondering where my granddaughter was. She turned on her heel and bolted out of the conference room, leaving the heavy wooden door slamming shut behind her. How far do you think she will make it before she realizes what I did to her car? Valerie lunged for the heavy mahogany door of Mr. Sterling's office. Her designer heels clicked frantically against the polished hardwood floor, sounding like a panicked heartbeat. She thought she was going to burst through that doorway, run straight to her luxury car, and vanish into the wind, just like she did a decade ago. She genuinely believed she could just drive back to my house, pack up my innocent granddaughter, and disappear into the dark shadows. But I was no longer just a grieving, heartbroken mother. I was a grandmother, fighting a war for the very survival of my bloodline. I sat perfectly still in my oversized leather chair. I did not scream for help. I did not try to physically block her path. I just watched her panic with a cold, righteous satisfaction. She gripped the shiny brass door handle and yanked it violently backward. But the door did not swing open into an empty, quiet hallway. Standing right there on the other side of the threshold were two tall men in sharp, dark suits. They were police detectives. They stepped forward in perfect unison, their broad shoulders completely blocking her only route of escape. Valerie slammed on the brakes, her eyes darting frantically back and forth between the two men. She stumbled backward, bumping hard into a leather waiting chair, her breathing shallow and erratic. I stood up slowly from the conference table. I smoothed down the front of my black morning suit, feeling the heavy fabric against my shaking hands. I looked at her trembling frame and delivered the cold, hard truth. I asked her if she really thought I would come to a legal meeting with a wanted federal fugitive and not bring some insurance. I told her that I had not slept a single wink the night before. The moment I found Marcus's hidden cloud drive and read the FBI appointment confirmation, my grief had transformed into pure burning gasoline. I did not just sit in my room and cry. I printed every single document my brilliant son had gathered. I printed the old newspaper articles about Serena Vance. I printed the federal embezzlement warrants. I printed the birth certificate of the poor dead infant whose identity she had so callously stolen. And first thing this morning, hours before our scheduled meeting to supposedly sign the house over Mr. Sterling, and I walked those papers straight into the local police precinct. We handed a mountain of undeniable evidence directly to the authorities. The older detective pulled a shiny pair of silver handcuffs from his belt. He stepped into the room and addressed her not as Valerie, but as Serena Vance. He told her she was under arrest for felony identity theft, grand larceny, and federal embezzlement. The sound of her real buried name, coming from the mouth of a police officer, shattered the last remaining piece of her sanity. Valerie let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed off the high ceilings of the law firm. She thrashed wildly. Her expensive designer purse flew across the room, hitting the wall and spilling her bright lipsticks and stolen credit cards everywhere. The perfect, sophisticated, grieving widow facade melted away completely, revealing the ugly, desperate criminal hiding underneath. She kicked and clawed like a trapped feral animal. The detectives grabbed her flailing arms, twisting them firmly behind her back, and forced her out into the main lobby of the firm. The secretaries and paralegals stood frozen at their desks, watching in absolute shock as the elegant woman they had seen walk in minutes earlier was now foaming at the mouth in a total, screaming emotional breakdown. The sharp click of the metal handcuffs locking around her wrists sent her into a blind, vicious rage. She realized it was truly over. She stopped fighting the officers and turned her wild, hateful eyes toward me. Her face was twisted into a hideous sneer, her teeth bared like a cornered predator. She dropped every ounce of her sweet daughter-in-law act. She screamed that I was a meddling, pathetic old hag. She cursed my name, and then she cursed my beautiful, loving son. And then right there in the middle of the crowded lobby, in a moment of pure, unadulterated evil, she confessed to the one thing I had feared most in the darkest corners of my heart. She tilted her head back and laughed a manic, breathless, sickening laugh. She screamed that Marcus was a fool. She bragged that he actually thought he was so smart, digging into her past in the middle of the night, setting up secret meetings with federal agents. But she noticed him locking his home office. She noticed him changing his passwords on his computer. She knew he was going to turn her into the FBI and ruin the comfortable, wealthy life she had stolen for herself. So she stopped him. She looked me dead in the eye, spit flying from her lips, and screamed that she swapped his crucial heart medication with something lethal. She proudly admitted that she watched him clutch his chest and collapse onto the cold, hardwood floor of his office. She told me with a sick gleam in her eye that she stood over him and waited until he took his final, agonizing breath before she finally picked up the phone to call for an ambulance. She murdered my boy to cover up her past. The words hit me like a speeding freight train. My knees went completely weak, and for a split second, the entire lobby spun around me. My only child, the boy I scrubbed dirty floors to put through college, the man who loved his little daughter more than he loved his own oxygen. He had died in sheer terror and absolute agony on his own office floor, while the monster he married watched him fade away. The betrayal was sickening. A deep, heavy sob caught in my throat, threatening to rip me apart, but I swallowed it down. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. I refused to let this monster see me break. I gathered every ounce of strength left in my tired bones and stepped forward until I was standing just inches away from her face. My hands were shaking violently at my sides, but my voice was as steady and cold as a winter storm. I looked deep into her dark, empty eyes, cutting through her manic laughter. "You thought you could bury my son and steal his life?" I whispered. making sure every single syllable pierced her black soul. But Marcus reached from beyond the grave to protect us. He knew exactly what you were. He tied your greed to a background check because he knew you would never walk away from the money, but you could not take it without exposing your fingerprints. He built a trap you could not escape. You are nothing but a ghost, Serena, and now you are a caged one. There were no dramatic explosions or movie-style courtroom speeches in the days that followed. The real world does not work like a television show. Real justice is cold, it is slow. It is measured in endless stacks of legal paperwork, sworn affidavits, and the heavy, undeniable slam of a steel jail cell door. When the detectives escorted the woman I knew as Valerie out of the law firm of Mr. Sterling that afternoon, she was completely stripped of her glamorous facade. She looked small, disheveled, and utterly pathetic as they loaded her into the back of a black, unmarked police cruiser. I stood by the tall glass windows of the lobby and watched the car pull away down the busy street. A strange, heavy silence washed over me. I did not feel a sudden burst of joy. I only felt a deep, hollow exhaustion. My son was still gone, but I had successfully honored his final wish. I had trapped the monster. The legal fallout crashed down on her like a violent avalanche. The authorities did not play games with Serena Vance. First came the federal marshals. Because she had crossed state lines to flee her original crimes, she was immediately extradited back to Oregon to finally face her charges for embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from the senior citizens charity. But that was only the very beginning of her nightmare. The federal prosecutors piled on a mountain of new charges. They indicted her for aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and forgery. They explicitly detailed how she had wandered into a rural Texas graveyard, found the weathered headstone of an infant girl who had died of pneumonia decades ago, and stolen the name of that poor baby to build a fraudulent life. The prosecutors made sure the judge knew exactly how cold-blooded she truly was. She was denied bail instantly. She was locked away in a high-security federal detention center, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit completely stripped of her designer clothes and expensive jewelry. But the most severe consequence was yet to come. Following her horrific confession in the law firm lobby, the local police officially opened a homicide investigation into the sudden death of my son. They obtained a court order to run a detailed toxicology screen on the tissue samples kept by the county coroner. The medical examiner found exactly what she had bragged about. Marcus did not suffer a natural heart attack. His prescribed blood pressure medication had been deliberately swapped with a lethal dose of a totally different pharmaceutical drug, one designed to induce massive cardiac arrest. The district attorney immediately began preparing first-degree murder charges. Serena Vance was looking at spending the rest of her natural life behind bars, surrounded by cold concrete walls. She would never see the outside of a prison again. While she sat in her tiny cell, the financial empire she had desperately tried to steal slipped permanently through her greedy fingers. The 30-day deadline mandated by the secret will of Marcus arrived. Obviously, sitting in a federal penitentiary under her real identity, Serena Vance could not provide a clean federal background check. She definitely could not provide an original certified birth certificate matching the name Valerie. She failed every single condition my brilliant son had laid out in his final legal document. Mr. Sterling executed the paperwork with swift, surgical precision. The hidden clause was officially triggered. In a matter of hours, the entire estate defaulted automatically into the irrevocable trust. The large suburban house, the life insurance policies, the retirement accounts, the vintage cars, every single asset Marcus owned was completely locked down. As the sole executor of the trust, I took immediate control of everything on behalf of my granddaughter Maya. Serena got absolutely nothing, not a single red cent. The woman who had abandoned her own flesh and blood to chase a wealthy lifestyle was left entirely bankrupt. All her stolen money had already been seized by the federal government to pay back the elderly victims she had defrauded years ago. She had gambled her entire existence on the assumption that I was a weak, easily manipulated old woman. Her devastating loss was absolute. It did not take long for the shocking truth to leak out into our community. Secrets like that cannot be contained for very long. The local evening news ran a massive segment on the fugitive widow who murdered her husband. When the story broke, the reaction from the people around us was swift and unforgiving. The members of our church congregation, the very same people who had pitied her at the funeral repast, were absolutely horrified. Sister Jenkins, the woman who had gasped when Serena handed me the eviction notice, called me in tears. She apologized profusely for ever feeling sorry for the grieving young widow. The church elders held a special prayer service for Marcus and Maya, completely washing their hands of the woman they now knew was a dangerous imposter. Her upscale social circle abandoned her just as quickly. The wealthy suburban mothers she used to drink wine with the ladies from the country club, and her expensive shopping buddies deleted her from their lives overnight. Nobody wanted to be associated with a federal fugitive and a cold-blooded murderer. Her phone numbers were blocked. Her social media profiles were investigated and shut down. She was entirely erased from the society she had murdered my son to be a part of. She became a total outcast. A dark, cautionary tale whispered about at dinner parties. All the status she killed for was gone like dust in the wind. I spent those first few weeks securing the estate and changing every single lock on the large house. I hired an upscale moving company to pack up all of her remaining clothes and cheap possessions. I did not keep a single item that belonged to her. I had the movers dump everything into a cheap storage unit and mailed the key directly to her public defender. I walked through the quiet, spacious rooms of the house Marcus had built, feeling a deep, profound sense of vindication. The air inside the home finally felt clean and light. The dark, suffocating presence of Serena Vance was completely gone. I had protected the legacy of my son. I had protected the financial future he worked so hard to build. Most importantly, I had protected Maya from a woman who saw her as nothing more than a prop. The nightmare of the last month was finally over. The justice my son demanded from beyond the grave was entirely fulfilled. The dust has finally settled after months of endless court dates and grueling depositions. A family court judge looked at the undeniable mountain of evidence, looked at my sweet granddaughter, and officially granted me full permanent custody of Maya. I remember the exact moment the judge slammed his wooden gavel down on the bench. A massive, suffocating weight immediately lifted off my chest. There were no more terrifying custody battles hanging over our heads, and no more crippling fear of a monster sneaking back to snatch her away in the dark. Serena Vance is locked away in a high-security federal penitentiary, where she belongs completely stripped of the lavish, stolen lifestyle she tried to build on the backs of innocent people. She will never cast a dark shadow over our lives again. This morning, the air feels completely different. I am sitting in a sturdy wooden rocking chair on the wide front porch of the beautiful suburban house I drained my entire retirement savings to help Marcus buy. For a long while, this place felt like a cold, terrifying crime scene, tainted by the lies and the quiet terror my son endured. But today, the heavy darkness has fully lifted. I spent weeks scrubbing this house clean, throwing out every single thing that belonged to that wicked woman, and erasing her footprint from our lives. It is no longer a site of trauma. It has become a true sanctuary. The morning sun warms my wrinkled face, and the sweet scent of blooming jasmine fills the crisp, clean air. Down in the green grass of the front yard, my precious Maya is running around chasing colourful butterflies. Her bright, carefree laughter rings out clear and loud, echoing beautifully off the old oak trees. She is wearing a bright yellow sundress, totally safe, fiercely protected, and deeply loved. When she turns and waves at me with that huge gap-toothed smile, My heart swells with a profound joy I honestly thought I would never experience again. We are building a new life together, just the two of us, filled with honesty and warmth. My grief is still a heavy, constant companion. I miss my son Marcus every single day. There are moments when I catch a glimpse of his old college jacket hanging in the hallway, or hear a certain familiar song playing on the radio, and the hot tears fall before I can even stop them. But the agonizing, sharp edge of that pain has slowly softened over time. It has been beautifully replaced by a towering, unshakable pride. I am so incredibly proud of the brilliant man I raised. When faced with absolute pure evil, Marcus did not run away. He did not surrender his family. He stood his ground and fought for us until his very last agonizing breath. He reached right through the veil of death to shield his little girl and his old mother from a vicious predator. He was a hero in every sense of the word, and I make sure to tell Maya every single day how much her father loved her. To everyone listening to my story right now, I want you to remember one very important lesson. Never ever doubt a mother's intuition. If you feel a cold chill in your bones, if you see a tiny crack in someone's perfect mask, trust that gut feeling. Do not let anyone make you feel crazy or overly sensitive. Secrets are a heavy, suffocating weight, and no matter how deep someone buries their dark past, the truth is like a stubborn, persistent seed. It will always find a way to break through the hard dirt and reach the light. We cannot always stop bad people from trying to enter our lives, but we absolutely have the power to stand up, fight back, and refuse to be their victims. If my journey touched your heart today, please leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from. I read every single one of your messages, and your incredible support means the absolute world to me. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more true life stories. Stay strong, trust your intuition, and always protect the ones you love. Thank you so much for listening, and God bless you all.